Ladies and gentlemen, there lies a profound mystery within the intricate gears of the human mind, one that sits so close to our awareness that we rarely pause to dissect it. It feels commonplace, almost invisible, simply because it unfolds within us every single day. Yet, beneath that surface of familiarity lies a complex psychological landscape, teeming with coded signals, recurring patterns, and silent currents that mold our relationships long before a word is ever spoken. One of the most formidable of these forces is the phenomenon of thinking about a specific person repeatedly. We are prone to labeling it as coincidence, a wandering mind, or a fleeting distraction. However, the human psyche does not operate on chaos. It does not stubbornly return to the same individual without a distinct purpose. When a single person begins to dominate your inner world with relentless consistency, something significant is transpiring. Your subconscious has marked this as critical, unresolved, or deeply resonant. Human beings are architects of meaning. Our minds are in a constant state of sorting, ranking, and evaluating importance. We recognize these patterns by instinct. We are drawn to emotional significance, even when logic tells us to move on. So when someone continues to resurface in your thoughts, it is not an accident. It is the mind signaling that this person has crossed a psychological threshold. They have been assigned weight. They now occupy space in your internal hierarchy of importance. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And nowhere is this more evident than in the quiet persistence of thought. The unconscious mind does not knock loudly. It whispers. It repeats. It returns you again and again to the same image, the same face, the same memory, because something within you is unfinished. At first, this mental presence may feel harmless. You replay conversations. You imagine alternative outcomes. You wonder what they meant. You notice how others compare to them. But gradually, something deeper begins to take shape. Your thoughts are not passive. They organize your perception. They influence your emotions. They shape your behavior long before you are aware of it. When someone becomes a recurring figure in your mind, you begin orienting yourself around them in subtle ways. Your tone changes when you speak to them. Your awareness sharpens in their presence. You anticipate their reactions. You hesitate where you once acted freely. You adjust your behavior without consciously deciding to do so. This is not fantasy. It is psychology. Attention restructures behavior. And here is where the phenomenon becomes truly profound. Thought does not exist in isolation. Human interaction is not a closed system. It is reciprocal, a feedback loop of attention, emotion, and perception. The moment someone becomes significant in your inner world, that significance begins to leak outward into your interactions, your expressions, your energy. You send signals without intending to. A glance held a moment too long, a warmth in your voice, a hesitation before speaking, a sensitivity to their presence that did not exist before. And human beings, whether they admit it or not, are exquisitely sensitive to these signals. They register them below the level of conscious thought. The person you keep thinking about begins to feel something shift. They may not understand it, they may not label it, but they sense a change in the emotional atmosphere between you. A subtle pull, a curiosity, a heightened awareness. Something that did not exist before now quietly does. This is not mystical. It is not supernatural. It is the psychological reality of human connection. We are wired to detect attention, especially when it is directed at us consistently. The nervous system responds before the intellect has time to intervene. The body knows before the mind explains. When two people enter each other's mental landscapes, even asymmetrically at first, influence begins. Your attention alters the way you engage with them, and that altered engagement becomes data for their mind. They begin responding to cues they cannot quite name. Their perception of you shifts. Their emotional state subtly reorganizes itself around the new pattern. Attention in this sense is a force. It creates gravity, and gravity pulls. As your focus deepens, the relational field between you changes. Conversations feel different. Silence feels charged. Presence carries weight. You are no longer neutral figures in each other's world. Something is forming beneath the surface, invisible yet active. Carl Jung observed, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." The reaction does not require confession. It does not require intention. It only requires sustained presence in the inner world of another. Your thoughts shape your reality first. They determine what you notice, what you value, and what you invest emotional energy in. When a person rises to the top of that internal hierarchy, they become integrated into your psychological system. You begin orienting decisions in their direction. You measure experiences against them. You feel their absence more sharply. You replay their presence more vividly. And this internal reorganization does not remain private. The other person begins to feel the consequences. They think of you more often than before. They react differently when you appear. They interpret your words with greater sensitivity. They sense an undercurrent that was not there previously. Something in their inner world rearranges itself because something in yours already has. This is the essence of human relational psychology. Attention shapes reality, not only internally, but interpersonally. Before any action is taken, before any declaration is made, before any decision is conscious, the invisible architecture of connection is already being constructed. And this architecture rests on a single foundation: significance. When someone occupies your thoughts repeatedly, your mind is pointing toward unfinished meaning, a question unresolved, an emotion unintegrated, a possibility not yet understood. And wherever there is unfinished meaning, transformation is already underway. What you are experiencing is not mere fixation. It is a psychological signal, a compass, an invitation to examine what part of you has been activated, what aspect of your inner world has been stirred. And as this process continues, the person at the center of your thoughts does not remain untouched. They begin to respond, to feel, to shift. Even if they cannot explain why, your attention has already entered their world. Thought is not passive. Emotion is not contained. Attention is not harmless. It is the first movement in a much larger psychological unfolding, one that quietly sets the stage for everything that follows. When someone occupies your thoughts with this level of persistence, something subtle yet powerful begins to unfold inside the other person, long before they consciously reflect on you. Their inner world starts responding to the quiet pressure of significance. Human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to attention, not because we are vain, but because attention signals meaning. It tells the psyche, you matter here, you register, you have impact. And when that signal is repeated, the mind cannot ignore it. At first, this response does not announce itself clearly. It does not arrive as a declaration or a sudden realization. Instead, it manifests as a faint disturbance in their internal equilibrium, a question without words, a feeling without explanation. They may notice themselves thinking of you at unexpected moments, not deliberately, not romantically, not even emotionally at first, but curiously. You appear in their mind without invitation, just as they have appeared in yours. And the mind, faced with this recurrence, begins its natural work. It searches for meaning. The human psyche cannot tolerate unexplained repetition. When something returns again and again, the mind assumes it carries significance. And so, the person you are thinking about begins, often unconsciously, to reflect on their role in your life. Why am I here? What do I represent to this person? What part of me is being seen, remembered, or held? This process is rarely linear. It does not follow the tidy logic of conscious reasoning. Instead, it unfolds in fragments. Memories surface. Small moments gain disproportionate weight. Interactions that once felt neutral begin to feel charged with implication. The mind starts drawing invisible lines between past encounters and present sensations, trying to understand why this particular connection feels alive. This is the beginning of self-reflection, induced by attention. Your focus acts as a mirror, forcing the other person to see themselves differently, not as a solitary individual moving through the world untouched, but as someone who exists meaningfully in another's inner landscape. And that realization, whether acknowledged or resisted, has consequences. Carl Jung wrote, "The soul demands your attention, or it will make itself known in uncomfortable ways." Attention from another often awakens the soul, precisely because it disrupts the illusion of invisibility. To be held in someone's thoughts is to be seen at a depth that bypasses performance and social masks. And the psyche responds to this exposure by turning inward. They may begin to examine their behavior around you more closely. Words spoken casually before are now replayed internally. Gestures are reconsidered. Silences are reinterpreted. This is not narcissism. It is self-assessment. The mind recalibrating itself in response to perceived importance. What is striking about this process is how involuntary it is. One cannot simply decide not to be affected by attention. The nervous system reacts before the ego has time to construct defenses. Even resistance is a form of engagement. Even denial acknowledges the presence of something that must be denied. As reflection deepens, the person may start asking themselves questions that feel oddly personal and yet unavoidable. What do I evoke in this person? Why do I feel different when I am around them? What part of myself comes alive, or becomes tense, or feels unusually exposed in their presence? These questions are not always conscious. Often they appear as moods, hesitations, or subtle emotional shifts. A seriousness that enters the room, a warmth that feels unfamiliar, a discomfort that signals vulnerability. Attention brings awareness, and awareness brings responsibility. To be significant to another is to be confronted with one's own capacity to influence. And influence is unsettling. It demands reflection. As this internal process unfolds, behavior begins to change quietly but measurably. The person may become more deliberate around you, less careless with words, more attentive to your reactions. They may notice themselves holding back or leaning in without understanding why. These are not strategic choices. They are instinctive adjustments produced by heightened self-awareness. They may begin to sense that their actions matter in a way they did not before, that they are being registered, remembered, perhaps even carried internally by someone else. This realization shifts posture, tone, and presence. A human being who feels seen does not move through the world the same way. Your attention has altered the context in which they experience themselves, and this effect does not remain confined to moments when you are together. It seeps outward into their broader inner life. They may find themselves reflecting on patterns in their relationships, on how they show up for others, on how they manage closeness and distance. Your focus has activated a wider process of introspection. Sometimes this reflection brings clarity. Sometimes it brings discomfort. Being significant to another forces confrontation with one's own emotional availability, integrity, and desires. It exposes contradictions that were easy to ignore in isolation. Why do I respond to this person differently? Why do I feel both drawn and unsettled? Why does their attention matter more than I expected? These questions do not demand immediate answers, but they reshape the terrain of the psyche. The person begins to understand themselves differently because you have positioned them differently in your inner world. This is how attention transforms identity. Not by force, but by invitation. Not by instruction, but by presence. And here is the paradox. The more they sense your attention, the more they reflect on themselves. The more they reflect, the more emotionally engaged they become. And the more engaged they become, the more responsive they are to you. A quiet feedback loop forms, deepening the psychological connection, without either of you consciously choosing it. This loop is powerful because it operates beneath awareness. It does not rely on promises or declarations. It relies on resonance, on the simple fact that one human mind has made room for another, and that room has been felt. As reflection continues, dormant aspects of the person may begin to surface. Desires long ignored, vulnerabilities long protected, questions about connection they thought were settled. Your attention has disturbed the equilibrium, and disturbance is often the precursor to growth. Carl Jung observed, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Being held in someone's thoughts often illuminates both light and shadow. It reveals what we long for and what we fear. It forces awareness of emotional truths that are easier to avoid when we believe no one is paying attention. This is why your persistent focus is never neutral. It calls forth reflection. It invites self-examination. It activates layers of the psyche that lie dormant in the absence of meaningful attention. And while the person may not articulate this process, while they may attribute their feelings to coincidence or circumstance, the transformation is already underway. They are no longer unchanged by you. They are no longer untouched by your inner presence. Something in them has begun to move. And as this movement continues, it does not stop at reflection alone. Awareness inevitably seeks expression. Thought begins to influence behavior. Emotion begins to shape action. The internal shifts demand an outward response. This is where the invisible begins to take form. As awareness begins to stir inside them, it does not remain contained as a private realization. It begins to leak outward into the smallest mechanics of interaction. Human beings do not simply think differently and remain outwardly unchanged. Our internal state always finds a way to express itself through micro-behaviors, shifts in timing, subtle alterations in tone and posture. And when the person you keep thinking about starts sensing their significance in your inner world, their behavior begins to recalibrate around you, almost as if the relationship has acquired a new gravity. This is not dramatic at first. It is quiet, nearly invisible. But it is consistent. They become more attentive in moments where they once would have been casual. They pause before speaking, as though measuring the weight of their words. They look a little longer. They listen a little more carefully. Or they do the opposite. They withdraw slightly, not because they feel nothing, but because increased significance can feel like exposure. And exposure activates defense. People respond to attention in different ways depending on their emotional structure. Some lean in, some step back. But both responses indicate the same underlying fact. Something has registered. You begin to notice it in timing, the speed with which they reply, the hesitation before responding, the way their energy shifts when you enter a space, the way they become more aware of your presence than they were before. They may not name it, but their nervous system has tagged you as emotionally relevant. And once the nervous system tags relevance, behavior follows. This is the psychology of reciprocity. Attention calls forth attention. Presence invites presence, not because someone is forced, but because the human mind is designed to respond to perceived significance. We are social organisms, constantly scanning for cues that indicate where we stand, what we mean, what role we play. When your attention has been consistent, the other person begins to scan you differently as well. They read your expressions. They notice shifts in your mood. They track your tone more carefully. They become alert to nuance, even if they do not consciously admit they care. They begin behaving as though the stakes are higher. This is where relational dynamics start evolving, before any clear conversation happens. The relationship begins to move underground, guided by signals rather than statements. And these signals are powerful, precisely because they are not performed. They are not staged. They come from the unconscious. They come from automatic responses. They are honest, even when the person tries to appear indifferent. A person who feels watched with care becomes more self-aware. A person who feels emotionally registered becomes more emotionally activated. And that activation changes how they show up. Sometimes this takes the form of subtle generosity. They become more helpful, more thoughtful. They remember small details. They ask questions they never asked before. Their behavior shifts toward maintenance of the connection, toward preserving the thread that now feels significant. Other times, the shift emerges as test behavior. They probe. They say something slightly provocative to see your reaction. They pull away briefly to see if you follow. They become inconsistent not because they want to hurt you, but because they are trying to locate the boundaries of your attention and the meaning behind it. The psyche often tests what it does not fully understand. If they sense your focus, if they sense your intensity, they will often seek confirmation, not necessarily through direct questions, but through subtle experiments. Humans do this instinctively. We test relational reality because certainty requires evidence. So they create moments. They linger in conversations. They insert themselves into your orbit, or they disappear and reappear, trying to measure whether your attention remains steady. These behaviors can be confusing, but they are usually expressions of one thing: the mind trying to calibrate significance. Because to be significant is to carry risk. It means the connection matters enough to have consequences, and consequences produce fear in the unprepared psyche. This is why the person may seem both drawn and guarded, warm and distant, curious and resistant. The nervous system is moving toward you, while the ego attempts to maintain control. And the more your attention persists, the more the internal tension intensifies. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist persists." If the person begins to resist the implications of your connection, they may find themselves thinking about you even more. The attempt to push significance away often deepens its psychological hold. The mind cannot easily discard what has been emotionally marked. This is where the behavioral adjustment becomes more pronounced. They might start showing up in places where you are. They might reach out more often. Or if they are overwhelmed by what they sense, they might try to establish distance. Either way, the relationship has changed. A new pattern is forming. And patterns once formed begin to reinforce themselves. Because your behavior is also changing. Your attention has already altered you. The person picks up on it. Your tone, your pace, your energy, even your silence communicates. You may believe you are hiding your inner world, but the body speaks fluently. The nervous system cannot fully conceal desire, tension, curiosity, or emotional investment. So what begins as your private thought becomes a shared atmosphere. In social psychology, we often speak of mirroring and attunement. Two people begin to sync unconsciously. They match posture. They match rhythm. They adapt their speech patterns. They align emotionally without planning to. This is not romance alone. It is relational chemistry, a nervous system responding to another nervous system. When the other person begins mirroring you more, it's a sign that their subconscious has begun treating you as an emotional reference point. When they become more attuned, it's a sign your presence has weight, and weight changes behavior. They may start anticipating you, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle orientation. They notice when you are absent. They feel something shift when you are not there. They may catch themselves expecting your message, your voice, your input. This is one of the most important turning points in the unfolding dynamic. The person is no longer merely responding to you in moments. They are carrying you internally between moments. Your presence begins to exist inside their inner narrative. That is what attention does. It creates internal resonance. And once you are internalized, you become part of how they interpret experience. They compare others to you. They measure moments against the emotional imprint you have created. They find themselves thinking, what would they say about this? What would they think? What would they feel? At this stage, the person may not even like what is happening. They may not want the intrusion of significance. But the psyche does not consult preference when it assigns meaning. It assigns meaning based on impact. This is why small interactions can suddenly feel amplified. A brief conversation carries emotional weight. A casual message becomes loaded with interpretation. Silence becomes a canvas for projection. When two minds begin converging through repeated attention, everything becomes symbolic. And symbolic meaning is the language of the unconscious. This is also where misunderstandings can intensify, because heightened attention increases sensitivity. They may read too much into your tone. You may read too much into their silence. The atmosphere becomes charged because both nervous systems are scanning for proof. But even the tension is evidence. Indifference does not create analysis. Neutrality does not create heightened sensitivity. Only significance does. When someone starts behaving differently around you, reacting more strongly, becoming more careful, more inconsistent, more present, more avoidant, whatever form it takes, it is a sign that your attention has initiated change, and that change will not remain minor. Because once behavior adjusts repeatedly, identity begins to shift. The person starts becoming someone slightly different in your presence, and you start becoming someone slightly different in theirs. The relationship begins shaping the people inside it. And as this continues, something else begins to emerge beneath the behavior and beneath the reflection. An emotional echo becomes a shared emotional field. As this shared emotional field takes shape, something deeper begins to occur beneath awareness. The connection is no longer sustained merely by thought, reflection, or behavioral adjustment. It becomes emotional resonance, a state in which two inner worlds begin responding to each other, even in the absence of direct interaction. This is where the experience often feels confusing, intense, or strangely intimate without explanation. The person you keep thinking about begins to feel you not as a thought, but as a presence. Emotional resonance is subtle. It does not announce itself loudly. It moves through mood, intuition, and sensation. The person may wake up with a sense of heaviness or warmth they cannot trace. They may feel unusually reflective, restless, or emotionally stirred without an obvious cause. Their mind may return to you during quiet moments, not because they decided to think about you, but because something in their emotional landscape has been activated. This is the emotional echo of sustained attention. The psyche does not process attention as neutral data. It processes it as meaning, and meaning carries emotional charge. When someone has been made significant in another person's inner world, that significance reverberates. The emotional system begins responding even before conscious thought catches up. They may feel drawn toward you without understanding why, or unsettled in ways they cannot explain, or comforted by the mere thought of you. Even if the relationship itself remains undefined, these emotional states are not imagined. They are the nervous system responding to perceived relational relevance. The important distinction here is that the emotional echo does not depend on physical proximity. It does not require conversation. It does not even require mutual intention. It emerges from sustained psychological engagement, from the repeated holding of another person in mind with emotional energy. And emotional energy, once generated, does not remain contained. This is why the person may experience emotional shifts that seem disproportionate to the actual interaction between you. A small exchange carries unexpected weight. A brief silence feels louder than it should. A minor change in tone creates an outsized reaction. The emotional field has become sensitive because it has been activated repeatedly. As this sensitivity grows, the person becomes more emotionally attuned to you. They feel your presence more strongly when you are there, and in your absence, more sharply when you are not. Their emotional baseline subtly reorganizes itself around the connection. Even if they resist acknowledging it, they may find themselves replaying moments they thought were insignificant. They may attach meaning to gestures that once felt neutral. This is not obsession. It is emotional calibration. The psyche is trying to understand a signal that keeps repeating. Sometimes this emotional resonance produces longing, sometimes anxiety, sometimes tenderness, sometimes confusion. The form it takes depends on the individual's emotional history, attachment patterns, and capacity for vulnerability. But the presence of the echo itself indicates one thing clearly. The connection has moved beyond cognition and into feeling. And feeling is where human behavior becomes most consequential. At this stage, the person may experience inner conflict. Part of them responds to the emotional pull. Another part attempts to maintain equilibrium. They may oscillate between closeness and distance, clarity and confusion, openness and withdrawal. This oscillation is not instability for its own sake. It is the psyche negotiating significance. To feel emotionally affected by someone without clear structure or explanation challenges the ego's need for control. And when control is challenged, defenses emerge. They may rationalize their feelings away. They may tell themselves it is coincidence, stress, or imagination. They may redirect their attention elsewhere. But emotional resonance is not silenced by explanation. It persists, quietly influencing perception from beneath the surface. This is why the person may react strongly to things that seem small, why they may feel protective, curious, or reactive in ways they do not fully understand. Emotional resonance creates a sense of stake, and where there is stake, there is vulnerability. Your attention has made them vulnerable. Not because you intended to, not because they chose it, but because sustained significance opens emotional channels. And once opened, those channels seek expression. This is often the point where emotional truth begins pressing toward consciousness. The person may start asking themselves deeper questions, not just about you, but about themselves. Why does this affect me? What does this reveal about what I want? What am I avoiding by not naming this? These questions arise not from logic, but from emotional pressure. The psyche seeks coherence. It cannot tolerate unresolved resonance indefinitely. Carl Jung captured this dynamic when he said, "Emotion is the chief source of all becoming conscious." It is emotion that forces awareness, emotion that brings the unconscious into view. And when emotional resonance persists, something must eventually surface. It does not remain static. It wants direction. This is where subtle shifts in decision-making begin. Choices that once felt neutral are now weighed differently. Time allocation changes. Priorities reorganize. The person may find themselves gravitating towards situations that increase proximity to you, or distancing themselves to regain emotional control. Either movement is meaningful. The feeling that the relationship is moving, even if no one is steering it consciously. This is not destiny. It is psychological momentum. This is the quiet power of attention. It does not force outcomes. It creates conditions. It is no longer merely psychological. It is directional. It has momentum. It is bending perception, emotion, and behavior toward a point of convergence. Something is forming beneath awareness, pulling both inner worlds into alignment. And as this alignment strengthens, it begins influencing not just how the person feels, but where they are going. As this momentum continues to build, it begins shaping not only how the other person feels, but how they orient themselves in the world. Attention, once sustained, does not merely influence moments. It alters direction. It bends trajectories. The person may not consciously decide to move toward you, but they begin, quietly and incrementally, to move toward the meaning you represent. This movement rarely announces itself dramatically. It shows up in small choices that feel natural rather than deliberate. They find reasons to cross your path. They create openings for interaction, or they pause before making decisions that would distance them from you. Your presence becomes a reference point, not as an obligation, but as an internal coordinate their psyche has integrated. This is what psychological convergence looks like. Two inner worlds gradually aligning through sustained attention, emotional resonance, and repeated awareness. It is not control. It is not persuasion. It is alignment through significance. The human mind orients itself toward what feels meaningful. And meaning is not chosen arbitrarily. It is constructed through repetition, emotional charge, and unresolved psychological material. When you hold someone in your thoughts persistently, you are assigning them a role. You are placing them within the architecture of your inner life. And that placement creates a pull, not because they owe you anything, but because the psyche responds to being positioned. As the person senses this positioning, they begin adjusting their own internal map. They start considering how their life intersects with yours, how their choices ripple in relation to you, even if they resist the idea of connection. Resistance itself confirms engagement. The psyche does not push away what is irrelevant. It pushes away what matters and feels dangerous to ignore. At this stage, something subtle but decisive occurs. The person begins facing an internal threshold. Remaining unaware becomes uncomfortable. Remaining unchanged feels increasingly unnatural. The emotional, behavioral, and perceptual shifts demand integration. They may not act immediately. These questions are not theoretical. They carry emotional consequence. And because of that, they influence decision-making in ways the person may not consciously recognize. This is where trajectories begin to bend. The person may start making choices that align with the emotional current between you, or they may attempt to choose against it. But even opposition acknowledges the presence of a force. Neutrality is no longer available. And as their trajectory shifts, so does yours. Because convergence is reciprocal. As they move, you feel it. As you feel it, your attention responds. The feedback loop tightens, not through manipulation, but through mutual influence. This is how relationships evolve before they are named, before they are defined, before they are understood. There is an invisible architecture beneath human connection that most people never examine. It is built from attention, emotional resonance, reflection, and response. And once constructed, it guides behavior quietly, but persistently. What makes this process so powerful is that it respects autonomy. No one is forced. No one is compelled. Each person moves according to their own psychological structure. And yet, movement occurs. Alignment happens. Paths bend. This is the paradox of human connection. The deepest influences are often the least visible. And with this understanding comes responsibility. Because if attention is a force, then it carries ethical weight. What you repeatedly hold in your mind matters, not only for you, but for the person you are holding. Your focus can illuminate, but it can also burden. It can awaken, but it can also unsettle. To think deeply about someone is to enter their life, even silently. It is to participate in shaping their emotional landscape. And while this influence is not absolute, it is real. This does not mean you should fear your thoughts. It means you should respect them. It means recognizing that your inner world is not sealed off from the outer world. That consciousness is participatory. That what you attend to grows, and what grows begins to move. When someone lives in your mind day and night, it is not a trivial experience. It is a signal, a psychological marker pointing toward meaning, toward unfinished emotional material, toward a connection that has already begun shaping reality. And whether that connection becomes closeness, clarity, distance, or resolution, it will not leave either of you unchanged. Because attention transforms. It transforms perception. It transforms emotion. It transforms behavior. And over time, it transforms direction. This is not destiny. It is human psychology unfolding as it always has, beneath awareness, beneath language, beneath control. So, if an individual stubbornly refuses to leave your thoughts, do not simply write it off as a fabrication of your mind. Do not diminish it by labeling it a mere coincidence. Instead, inquire within. What specific dormant part of you has been awakened? What lesson is demanding to be woven into your fabric? What fundamental truth is standing there, waiting for your validation? And comprehend this reality. The person occupying your mind is already feeling the impact. It might be gradual, it might be faint, but it is undeniably occurring. Your focused attention has already crossed the threshold into their existence. This is the silent dominion of the psyche, the silent burden of high consciousness. It is the quiet marvel of human entanglement. The burdens you carry in your thoughts are never truly invisible. The object of your attention is never lifeless. Whatever you sustain with emotional voltage eventually manifests as real. And within that comprehension exists both a warning signal and a ray of hope. The warning is to remain vigilant regarding the energies you emit. And the hope is that your focus, when steered by self-awareness, honesty, and honor, can serve as a bridge rather than a load to bear. A bridge connecting two internal universes. A bridge spanning the distance between two lives, because every profound connection ignites long before a single word is ever vocalized. It starts in the thought process, in the gaze, and in the silent acknowledgement that a person has value. And once that acknowledgement takes root, the world never stays quite the same.